Extreme rain events are increasing at an alarming rate in the US and all over the world. But the problem isn't the amount of rain that falls in any one place, it's how long it takes the rain to fall. And fascinating new research sheds light on exactly how that's changing. Over the last century, global precipitation has only increased by 0.04 inches per decade. But looking at individual regions in the US, we can see that some places have experienced 30% more rain over the same period. However, more rain isn't the whole story. That's why the organization First Street created a groundbreaking risk map that shows a big change in what NOAA calls 100-year floods. These are events so extreme that the odds of them happening in any given year are about 1 in 100.
100-year precipitation event is occurring more often, about once every 7 to 8 years in the most extreme cases.
And that matters because infrastructure like sewer systems are built with this metric in mind. But why the change? It's because a warmer atmosphere is a thirstier atmosphere, meaning it can hold more moisture.
For each additional increase in temperature by 1 degree Celsius, the air can hold 7% more water vapor.
And that's fundamentally changing the hydrologic cycle. Dry times get drier and wet times get wetter at an exponential rate. And not only just on a yearly scale, but down to the hour and the minute. So First Street reanalyzed rainfall data across the US down to the minute. Their analysis uncovered an important trend and led to a new flood risk map of the United States. It turns out that some places currently seeing less annual precipitation and more drought should also expect more flooding. In this episode, we're going to look at this map to see what regions are most at risk and how we can adapt with all this additional water.
This is not something that anyone should go through when it comes to a disaster, especially a hurricane.
We can learn a lot from New York City when it comes to extreme rain because they're getting so much of it. Just last September, the city saw nearly 8 inches of rain in a single day.
A place like New York City used to be very, very green, and it was covered in lakes and streams. And over time, it's been filled in.
The same is true in nearly every city. We've replaced natural permeable surfaces with concrete and asphalt. Nearly 72% of New York City is now covered in impermeable surfaces. So instead of a natural water system, runoff has to be managed by a sewer system designed for a climate that no longer exists.
The original designers that built our sewer system did not know that we were going to have 3, 4, 5, 8 inches of rain.
1 in a 100-year event in New York City actually occurs about once every 35 years.
This is a new problem. So they can only manage about 1 to 2 inches of rain per hour.
Our infrastructure just can't keep up with all the rain that we're getting. And the NOAA maps, which are referred to as Atlas 14 and Atlas 2, that we use to project flood risk and figure out where to upgrade our infrastructure for flooding events, aren't keeping up with the rain either.
They use traditional historic methods for measuring precipitation risk, and for a long time that was perfectly fine. The problem is if you have an increasing precipitation trend, then all of a sudden now the average doesn't actually capture what the current events are. It actually pegs them back to a climate that could be as far as 20 or 30 years ago.
In other words, the NOAA maps look backwards and not forwards. So First Street decided to take a different approach to NOAA's data.
Our report was really focused on the extreme precipitation events as opposed to the average precipitation levels across the country. And it's not necessarily that we're seeing more of these events, but when we see them, they're more severe. We're seeing more severity in the intensity of the rainfall events over shorter durations, which is causing more flooding.
Amit Shiv Prasad lives in Hollis, Queens. His neighborhood has been impacted by flooding events for a long time, but recently it's gotten worse. Looking around, the area has very few green spaces to absorb rainwater, and Amit learned that this area used to be an actual lake.
So this is actually our house where you guys are right now. So if you look, it's actually sitting in the middle of a pond right now. And this is what the pond looked like back in 1928.
If you look at an old map of New York City and see where all the creeks and the lakes used to be, and then you look at today's flood map, you can actually see that it's pretty much identical.
FEMA's 100-year floodplain map derived from NOAA's Atlas 14 directly impacts the cost of and access to flood insurance. But since the map doesn't include flooding from rainstorms, many communities are left out and as a result, overexposed.
Flood insurance was never sold to anyone in this community because we don't live in a flood zone or a FEMA 100-year map.
But flooding has devastated this community. In 2021, after Hurricane Ida made landfall as a Category 4, it traveled up the eastern US, dumping record-breaking rainfall in its path. In New York City alone, it dropped over 7 inches, peaking at 3 inches of rain per hour. Amit's neighborhood was not prepared.
It started off as a normal day, had dinner with my folks, and all the warnings started to go off. Ran downstairs, grabbed my poncho, me and my dad, took our shovels and rake, went out to clean the basins like we do every single time it rains.
But the sewer basins on Amit's street weren't functioning that day.
The city was doing construction and they pretty much had all the basin covers covered. Noticed the rain was coming in higher, so I ran up and grabbed my keys, moved the truck up the block. Before I got back down to the end of the block, the entire street was flooded.
The flooding killed 13 people in New York.
11 of those people died in flooded basement apartments, most of them here in Queens. 43-year-old Famati Ramskreet and her 22-year-old son Krisha, also known as Tara and Nicholas, could not survive last night's rushing floodwaters, crashing through the wall and pouring into their basement apartment.
Tara and Nicholas were tenants in Amit's family's basement. Before Ida, he lifted the doors to his home 3 to 4 feet to prepare for flooding. But the storm brought too much water. He no longer rents out his basement and now uses the space for community events.
Unfortunately, the wall collapsed, and that's the reason why all the destruction happened. So I've done my part where it comes to repair. I just could pray and ask God that it never floods again. That's all.
Ida resulted in $75 billion in damages across the US. Over 33,500 buildings in New York City were destroyed, and Amit's remodel alone cost over $344,000. But not all areas were equally affected. Across the Hudson, Hoboken, New Jersey didn't suffer the same flooding, and this is partly because of their efforts to adapt to this new climate reality.
Flooding has always been a problem in the city of Hoboken. We were originally a tidal marsh. Actually, the area where we were standing, it was marshland. All of these low-lying areas that were marsh, that were filled in for industrialization in the early 1900s, are very subject to flooding today. We also have a combined sewer system where our stormwater and our sewage flow into the same pipes. Now, with climate change, we're seeing more frequent storms, more severe storms.
To address the flooding issues, Hoboken has been building resiliency parks around the city. We went on a tour of the largest park to understand how these green spaces operate.
This is one of the 19 rain gardens that is in Resilient City Park. And these rain gardens will manage water during a rain event. You'll see that it almost looks like a pond. Water is slowly being delayed from entering our stormwater system. It's filtered through the rain garden, through all the plants and the soil. Then that water slowly drains into the underground tank that's below the park and then goes out to our sewer system. And that's all water that then is not on our streets during a rain event. Our 1 million-gallon detention tank that is under this lawn can detain stormwater that comes from the park site itself, as well as from all of northern Hoboken.
And it's working. Hoboken has seen an 88% decrease in flooding events since installing these mitigation measures, and only time will tell if these measures hold up against future climate changes, but it's strong proof of concept. The comparison of Hoboken and Hollis also follows another trend. Recent studies find that race and wealth play a big role in where natural disaster recovery efforts happen, and this impacts safety and economic outcomes for residents. A study from 2018 found that in areas with at least $10 billion in damages from a natural disaster, white families actually saw a wealth increase of about $126,000 post-recovery, while Black families saw a wealth decrease of $27,000. This map shows the extent of this wealth gap in some major cities across the US. Hoboken is 64% white, while Amit's neighborhood in Queens is just 1.4% white.
1.3 million New Yorkers live either in or directly adjacent to a floodplain. and that's going to go up to be over 2 million by the turn of the century. Half of those people are considered low income by HUD, our federal government, and half of those people are communities of color.
Hollis, which is a mixed neighborhood in Queens, and the adjacent Queens Village underwent a $24 million sewer expansion from 2019 to 2021 to try to address the flooding problem. However, the Hollis community still experiences frequent flooding.
My neighbor across the street, every time she rains, she comes over to our house because she's afraid that her wall is going to collapse again. And it's a sad thing that everyone in the community is feeling the same way.
As the climate changes and the wet times get wetter, intervention efforts become increasingly more complicated and challenging.
And this is going to be one of probably the biggest issues that we're going to face over the next 20 years. Is going to be, where are we going to stay and where are we going to leave? There's no one solution for every neighborhood or for every place.
But there's hope for flood mitigation efforts. Every dollar spent on flood mitigation sees up to an $8 return.
So we can manage that water with green infrastructure and turn New York City into a sponge. In every neighborhood, in every place that we can possibly do it, we'd like to absorb water. So that could be on our streets, it could be on our green roofs, or it could be in our parks.
Now that we understand the challenges and opportunities to deal with urban flooding, let's get back to First Street's new risk map, which focuses mostly on flooding from heavy rainfall events.
There's about 8 million properties currently in FEMA's special flood hazard area, compared to our about 17.7 million properties. Most of that, about 65% of that gap that we see, is actually driven by precipitation risk.
In fact, by FEMA's own estimate, from 2015 to 2019, 40% of flood insurance claims came from outside of the high-risk zones on the FEMA map. But maybe the most surprising is the update to NOAA's flood maps. This shows the difference between NOAA's maps and what First Street found, where 100-year floods are now more like 35-year floods, like in the case of New York City. Their study even found that in some areas, 100-year floods have now become just 8-year floods, making them more than 12 times as likely.
The Midwest, in particular, sees a lot of underrepresentation of those 1 in 100-year events. Places like southern Indiana and northern Kentucky, around the Louisville, Kentucky metro area, they're seeing the 1 in 100-year depth from the NOAA Atlas 14 records as much as 1 in 7 or 1 in 8 years.
According to First Street, not only the Midwest, but the entire northeastern part of the United States has a hidden risk of extreme precipitation. And even in Northern California, which is seeing a decrease in precipitation overall, the likelihood of a 100-year flood is now 1 in 35. With climate change, we're seeing strange patterns and complex impacts to our weather systems. We may not know exactly what a warmer world will look like, but it's clear that change is happening. So it seems like it would be wise for us to adapt. In this episode, we've learned the stakes of flooding from these extreme rainfall events and looked at places like the city of Hoboken, a place that's doing a great job at navigating these changes to our hydrologic cycle. But I'm curious, how's your community adapting to these changes? Let us know in the comments below.